The church was silent. 200 people held their breath as the hand moved through the air in slow motion. The sound echoed like thunder against stained glass windows. She stumbled back, her hand rising to her cheek, eyes wide with shock and something else, something deeper, pain that had been buried for 30 years. The groom stood there, chest heaving, tears streaming down his face, his bride frozen at the altar in her white dress. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that terrible silence, everything everyone thought they knew about this family shattered like glass hitting concrete. They said it was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. They said he was the kindest man in town, the son who would never raise his voice, let alone his hand. But what pushed him to this moment, what his mother had just whispered in front of God and everyone, would change not just the wedding, but every single person in that room. If you stay until the end of this story, you'll understand why some secrets should never be kept, and why sometimes the people we love the most are the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. What could a mother possibly say on her son's wedding day that would provoke such a reaction? Why did some of the older guests, the ones who knew the family for decades, shake their heads as if they'd been expecting this? What was the bride's face telling us in that frozen moment? Was it surprise, or was it something she already knew? And why, in the hours leading up to that ceremony, had 3 different people tried to stop this wedding from happening? There's a truth buried in this story that goes back further than anyone wants to admit. A truth about love and lies and the things parents do to protect their children, even when that protection becomes a prison. This isn't just about a slap. This is about a family secret that should have been told years ago, in the price everyone paid for silence. Marcus grew up in a small town in Georgia where everyone knew everyone, and your reputation meant everything. His mother, Eleanor, raised him alone after his father disappeared when Marcus was just 3 years old. Nobody talked about where his father went. Some said he left for another woman. Others whispered darker theories, but Eleanor never spoke his name again. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to keep their small house and put Marcus through school. He was everything to her purpose, her pride, her reason for waking up every morning before dawn. Marcus grew into the kind of man that made his mother's sacrifices worth it. He volunteered at the community center, coached Little League on weekends, and worked as a physical therapist, helping people recover from injuries. Everyone in town loved him. When he met Sarah at a hospital charity event 3 years ago, people said they'd never seen him smile so wide. Sarah was a nurse from 2 towns over, soft-spoken with a laugh that made everyone around her feel lighter. They dated for 2 years before Marcus proposed on the same bridge where they'd had their first real conversation. Eleanor seemed happy about the engagement at first. She hugged Sarah, welcomed her to family dinners, even helped pick out wedding invitations. But as the wedding date approached, something shifted. Eleanor became distant, almost cold. She'd stare at Sarah during dinners with an expression Marcus couldn't read, something between fear and recognition. Sarah noticed it too, but said nothing, trying to be respectful, trying to believe it would pass. 3 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor asked Marcus to postpone it. She said she had a feeling, a bad feeling, that something wasn't right. Marcus laughed it off, attributed it to normal mother-of-the-groom anxiety, the fear of losing her son to another woman. He assured her nothing would change, that she'd always be the most important woman in his life. But Eleanor didn't laugh. She just looked at him with eyes that held 3 decades of secrets and said quietly, "We need to talk about your father." Marcus hadn't heard those words in 27 years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear skies and the kind of warmth that makes you believe good things are about to happen. Marcus woke early in the house he grew up in, the same house where Eleanor had raised him alone, where every corner held memories of birthday parties and homework at the kitchen table, and his mother singing while cooking dinner after her second shift. He put on his suit, the one he'd saved for months to buy, and stared at himself in the mirror, wondering if his father, wherever he was, would have been proud. Downstairs, Eleanor was already dressed, but she looked pale, her hands trembling as she poured coffee she wouldn't drink. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have to talk now before you go to that church." He checked his watch, smiled, tried to ease the tension with a joke about cold feet being contagious. But Eleanor didn't smile. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped him with algebra, and taught him to pray and told him his father was never coming back. And she pulled out an old shoebox Marcus had never seen before. Inside were letters, photographs, documents he didn't understand at first. His father's face stared up at him from a faded picture, younger than Marcus remembered, standing next to a woman who wasn't Eleanor. There was a little girl in the photo too, maybe 4 or 5 years old, holding his father's hand. Marcus felt something cold spread through his chest. "Who is this?" he asked. Eleanor's hands shook as she spoke. "Your father didn't just leave us, Marcus. He had another family, another daughter, in the next county. He'd been living 2 lives for years before I found out. When I confronted him, he chose them and disappeared. I never told you because I didn't want you to grow up knowing your father chose someone else over us." Marcus stared at the photographs, his mind racing, trying to understand why she was telling him this now, on his wedding day, after keeping it secret for nearly 3 decades. And then Eleanor said the words that stopped his heart. That little girl in the photo, Marcus. Her name was Sarah. The room tilted, his vision blurred. He looked at his mother, waiting for her to say she was wrong, that it was a different Sarah, that this was some kind of terrible coincidence. But Eleanor's face told him everything. She'd known from the moment Marcus brought Sarah home, recognized something in her eyes, in the shape of her face, in the way she laughed. She'd spent months trying to confirm it, digging through old records, tracking down people who knew his father's other family, until finally, 2 weeks ago, she'd found proof. Sarah was his half-sister. The woman he loved, the woman waiting for him at the church in a white dress, was his own blood. Marcus felt like the walls were closing in. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His whole life, his whole future, the family he'd imagined building, it all collapsed in an instant. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Why did you wait until today?" Eleanor's tears came then, tears she'd been holding back for weeks. "I tried, Marcus. I tried to tell you, but I kept hoping I was wrong, kept hoping the evidence would prove me mistaken. I didn't want to destroy your happiness unless I was absolutely certain, but I am certain now, and I can't let you marry her. I can't let you make that mistake." Marcus grabbed his keys, ignoring his mother's pleas to stay and talk, to figure this out together. He drove to the church in a daze, his mind spinning with images of Sarah, of the life they'd planned, of children they'd talked about having, all of it now poisoned by this revelation. At the church, Sarah was radiant, surrounded by bridesmaids, her face glowing with joy. When she saw Marcus, she rushed over, concern flickering across her features. "You look pale," she said, touching his face. "Are you okay?" He couldn't speak, couldn't find words for what he'd just learned. The ceremony began like a dream, or a nightmare. Marcus couldn't tell which anymore. He stood at the altar, Sarah's hands in his, the priest's voice echoing through the church, and all he could see was that photograph, his father's hand on a little girl's shoulder, the little girl who'd grown into the woman he loved. And then, just as the priest asked if anyone objected to this union, Eleanor stood up. Her voice rang clear through the church. "I object. Stop this wedding. Marcus, you can't marry her. She's your sister." The church erupted in chaos. Gasps and whispers ricocheted off the walls like bullets. Sarah's face went white, her bouquet falling from shaking hands to scatter roses across the floor. Marcus's aunt jumped up, shouting at Eleanor to sit down, to stop embarrassing the family. Sarah's mother screamed that Eleanor was lying, that she was jealous and trying to ruin her daughter's happiness. But Eleanor stood firm, tears streaming down her face, holding up the photographs, the documents, the proof she'd spent weeks gathering. Marcus felt like he was watching it all from underwater, sounds muffled and distorted, faces blurring around him. Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice desperate. "Marcus, what is she talking about? Tell me she's lying. Tell me this isn't true." He looked at her, this woman he'd loved for 3 years, and saw his father's eyes staring back at him, features he'd somehow never noticed before, suddenly obvious now that he knew the truth. He pulled away from her, stepping back, and that's when Sarah's mother rushed forward with her own revelation. She'd been silent until now, standing frozen in the front pew. But Eleanor's accusation broke something open in her too. She climbed the altar steps, her voice shaking but determined. "It's not true," she said. "Eleanor, you're wrong. Yes, I knew your husband. Yes, he was in Sarah's life for a few years. But he wasn't her father. He was just a man I dated after Sarah's real father died. He left us too, just like he left you. But Sarah isn't his daughter. I have the birth certificate. I have hospital records. You can test them both right now if you want. But you're destroying two innocent people over a mistake, over an assumption." The church went deadly silent. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who stood clutching her box of evidence, her certainty suddenly shaken. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first hairline fracture of hope. "Is that true?" he asked Sarah's mother. The woman nodded, tears on her face. "I swear to you, Marcus, Sarah's father died in a car accident when she was 2. The man you knew as your father came into our lives years later. He never adopted Sarah. He was never legally her father. He was just someone who pretended to care before abandoning us too." Eleanor sank back into the pew, the box falling from her hands. The church waited. Marcus looked at Sarah, who was crying now, her whole body shaking. The priest, clearly out of his depth, suggested they adjourn to handle this privately. But Marcus knew what needed to happen next. He walked down the aisle, past the staring guests, past his sobbing mother, and called from his phone for an immediate DNA test appointment. "I'm not doing this," he said, his voice hollow. "I'm not building a marriage on maybe. We're getting tested today, right now, and we're getting the results before anyone leaves this church." For the next 3 hours, the wedding guests sat in stunned silence or wandered outside in small groups, whispering, speculating, taking sides. Some blamed Eleanor for causing a scene. Others blamed Sarah's mother for not being forthcoming about her past. Many just felt heartbroken for Marcus and Sarah, two people who'd done nothing wrong, but were caught in a web of old secrets and broken relationships. Marcus and Sarah went to an emergency clinic that offered rapid DNA testing. They sat in separate waiting rooms, unable to look at each other, both terrified of what the results might say. Sarah kept replaying her childhood, trying to remember the man who'd been around when she was young, the man her mother dated, but her memories were hazy, just impressions of someone tall who bought her ice cream and then disappeared. She'd been told so little about her mother's past, and now she understood why. The silence had been protection, or so her mother thought. The results came back in 2 hours, expedited because the lab understood the urgency. Marcus held the envelope with shaking hands, Sarah beside him, both of them barely breathing. He opened it, read the first line, and his knees buckled. Sarah caught him, her own tears starting before she even saw the paper. They were not related, not siblings, not even distant cousins. The DNA test confirmed what Sarah's mother had said. What Eleanor had feared was wrong. The man who'd abandoned both families had lied about so many things, but Sarah wasn't his daughter. She never had been. Marcus and Sarah stood in that clinic holding each other, sobbing with relief and exhaustion and the weight of what they'd just endured. When they returned to the church, still in their wedding clothes now wrinkled and stained with tears, the guests looked up with desperate hope. Marcus held up the results and simply said, "We're not related." The church exploded in cheers and tears and applause. But Marcus wasn't done. He walked to where his mother sat alone in the back pew, her face buried in her hands. Everyone watched as he approached her, tension thick in the air, waiting to see what he would do, how he would react to the woman who'd nearly destroyed the happiest day of his life. Eleanor looked up at him, her face aged 10 years in one afternoon, and whispered, "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was saving you from making the same mistakes, from being hurt the way I was hurt." I see her father in her face, Marcus. I see the man who destroyed our lives, and I couldn't let it happen again. And that's when Marcus, overwhelmed by 30 years of his mother's pain, by the realization of how deeply trauma had scarred her, by the understanding that her love had become fear and her protection had become control. That's when he raised his hand and struck her across the face. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching," below. Let's see who's here until the very end. The slap echoed through the church like a gunshot. Eleanor's head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming on her cheek. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Marcus stood there, his hand still raised, horror slowly dawning on his face as he realized what he'd done. Sarah screamed, rushing forward to step between them. The guests erupted in chaos again, some shouting at Marcus, others trying to defend him. Everyone's emotions boiling over after hours of unbearable tension. But Eleanor didn't move. She just sat there, one hand on her cheek, looking up at her son with eyes that held not anger, but something far more devastating, understanding. She understood in that moment that she'd pushed him too far, that her fear had nearly cost him everything, and that the violence of his reaction was born from the same place as her obsessive need to protect him, from trauma, from pain that had never healed, from wounds passed down like cursed heirlooms. Marcus collapsed onto the pew beside her, his whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," he choked out between sobs. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I couldn't. Everything just broke inside me." Eleanor pulled him into her arms the way she had when he was a child, when he'd skinned his knee or failed a test or come home crying because kids at school made fun of his secondhand clothes. She held her grown son and whispered, "I know, baby, I know. I broke something in you today. I've been breaking things in you for years without realizing it." Sarah stood watching them, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The guests slowly quieted, the moment too raw, too intimate for the chaos to continue. The priest, who'd seen many things in his 40 years of ministry but nothing quite like this, approached carefully and suggested they all take a breath. That perhaps this ceremony needed to become something else, a moment of healing rather than celebration. What happened next surprised everyone, most of all Marcus himself. Eleanor stood up, faced the congregation, and began to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, then grew stronger as she confessed everything. Not just about Marcus's father and the other family, but about her own childhood, about her father who'd abandoned her mother, about a pattern of abandonment and mistrust that had poisoned 3 generations. She talked about the shame she'd carried, about raising Marcus alone while terrified every day that she wasn't enough, that he'd grow up broken, that he'd leave her too or worse, that someone would hurt him the way she'd been hurt. She'd seen Sarah, seen her resemblance to the man who destroyed Eleanor's life, and all her old wounds had ripped open, bleeding fear into every interaction, every smile, until she couldn't see Sarah as a person anymore, only as a threat. "I turned my trauma into a weapon," Eleanor said, her voice breaking, "and I used it against my own son on the day he was supposed to be happiest. I thought I was protecting him, but I was really just trying to protect that scared young mother I used to be, the one whose husband walked out and never looked back. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry, Sarah. You both deserve better than this. Better than me bringing ghosts into your future." Sarah's mother stood then, walked across the church, and embraced Eleanor. "I forgive you," she said. "I understand what it's like to be afraid, to see dangers that aren't really there because the real dangers already hurt you so badly. We've both been carrying him, that man who hurt us both, and it's time we put him down. It's time we let our children be free of him." The 2 mothers held each other, crying for themselves, for their children, for all the years wasted on fear. Marcus watched them, then turned to Sarah, who stood in her rumpled wedding dress, looking exhausted and heartbroken, but still, somehow, present, still there, still choosing to stay despite everything. The twist that no one in that church expected came next. The priest, moved by what he'd witnessed, suggested they continue the ceremony, not as if nothing had happened, but acknowledging everything that had, transforming the wedding into something deeper, a ceremony of healing and forgiveness alongside the joining of 2 lives. Some guests left, unable to handle the emotional intensity, but most stayed, wiping their eyes and settling back into pews to witness what would come next. Marcus and Sarah stood at the altar again, but before they spoke vows to each other, they spoke vows to their mothers, promising to break the cycles of pain, to choose healing over hurt, to build a family founded on truth instead of secrets. Eleanor stood beside Marcus, her cheeks still red from where he'd struck her, and she spoke vows too, promising to let go, to trust, to stop trying to control the future because she feared the past. When the priest finally pronounced Marcus and Sarah married, the applause was different than it would have been hours earlier. Quieter, more profound. The sound of people who'd witnessed something more than a wedding, who'd seen a family break and begin to heal in the same breath. The reception was small, intimate, most of the guests having left during the hours of chaos. But those who remained formed a circle around the newlyweds and their mothers, and they ate cake and danced slowly and spoke quietly about pain and forgiveness and the courage it takes to choose love when fear would be so much easier. Late that night, after most guests had gone home, Marcus found his mother sitting alone outside the venue, staring at the stars. He sat beside her, neither speaking for a long time, until finally he said, "I never should have hit you. There's no excuse for that. I was wrong." Eleanor turned to him, took his face in her hands the way she had when he was small, and said, "You were right to be angry. I nearly destroyed your life today because I couldn't face my own past. We're both going to have to do better, both going to have to heal, or we'll just keep hurting each other and everyone we love." They sat together in the darkness, mother and son, both wounded, both beginning the long process of forgiving themselves and each other. Sarah joined them eventually, and the three of them talked until dawn, not about the wedding or the drama, but about building something new, a family that chose honesty over secrets, that faced pain instead of passing it down, that understood healing wasn't instant, but a daily choice, a daily practice, a daily act of courage. 6 months after the wedding, Marcus and Sarah bought a small house 3 blocks from Eleanor. They had dinner together every Sunday, slowly rebuilding trust, slowly learning to communicate without fear or defensiveness. Eleanor started seeing a therapist, finally addressing trauma she'd buried for 3 decades. She learned to recognize when her anxiety was about the present or about ghosts from her past. She learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. She learned slowly and painfully that protecting someone sometimes means letting them risk getting hurt, trusting they're strong enough to survive it. Marcus also started therapy, processing not just what happened at the wedding, but the anger he'd carried for years without realizing it. Anger at his father for leaving, at his mother for her hovering anxiety, at himself for not being enough to make either of them stay or relax. He learned that the slap wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of a lifetime of swallowed emotion, and that healing meant feeling things instead of pushing them down until they exploded. Sarah joined a support group for people with complicated family dynamics, finding community with others who understood what it was like to carry secrets, to discover truths that changed everything, to choose love even when family felt more like a battleground than a refuge. She learned to set boundaries with her own mother, gently but firmly insisting on honesty and transparency, refusing to repeat the pattern of protective lies that had nearly destroyed her marriage before it began. The 3 of them, Marcus, Sarah, and Eleanor, became closer than they'd ever been, not in spite of what happened at the wedding, but because of it. The crisis had forced them to face truths they'd been avoiding, to speak words that needed to be said, to acknowledge pain instead of pretending it didn't exist. They discovered that real intimacy isn't possible without honesty, even when honesty is devastating, even when it destroys the comfortable illusions people build to avoid facing their own wounds. Eleanor learned to see Sarah not as a reminder of her ex-husband, but as her own person, a kind and patient young woman who loved her son and who was trying her best to navigate an impossible situation with grace. Sarah learned to see Eleanor not as an obstacle or a villain, but as a scared woman who'd been hurt so badly that fear became her primary language, her default response to anything that reminded her of past pain. And Marcus learned the hardest lesson of all, that the people we love are broken, that we're all carrying wounds we didn't ask for, and that family isn't about being perfect or even about being right. It's about showing up anyway, choosing forgiveness anyway, trying again anyway, even after everything falls apart. A year after the wedding, they gathered to celebrate Marcus and Sarah's first anniversary. This time, there was no drama, no revelations, just dinner and laughter, and Eleanor telling embarrassing stories about Marcus as a child, while he groaned and Sarah laughed until she cried. At one point, Eleanor raised her glass and said, "To second chances, to families who heal together, to the courage to tell the truth even when it's hard." They all drank to that, their glasses catching the candlelight, their faces reflecting not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger, the choice to love each other through it. The slap became part of their family story, not something they were proud of, but something they didn't hide from either. Marcus had struck his mother in a moment of overwhelming emotion, and that was wrong, inexcusable, something he'd have to carry and work to never repeat. But Eleanor had also nearly destroyed her son's life because she couldn't face her own trauma, and that was wrong too. They were both broken people who'd hurt each other, and they were both trying to do better. "That's all any of us can do," Marcus said one night when Sarah asked how he'd forgiven himself. "We're all carrying damage, all capable of hurting people we love. The question isn't whether we'll mess up, because we will. It's whether we'll face what we've done, take responsibility for it, and do the hard work of changing." His mother taught him that, not through her words, but through her actions in the months after the wedding, through her willingness to admit she'd been wrong, to get help, to try to understand herself so she could stop hurting other people. Eleanor taught him that healing is possible even after the worst moments, even after you've broken something precious, as long as you're willing to pick up the pieces and examine them honestly instead of pretending they were never whole. The lesson wasn't just about forgiveness, though that was part of it. The lesson was about truth, about the cost of secrets, about how trying to protect people from pain sometimes causes more damage than the truth ever would. Eleanor had kept secrets about Marcus's father, and those secrets had festered and poisoned everything until they erupted at the worst possible moment. Sarah's mother had kept secrets too, and those secrets had created confusion and suspicion where clarity could have prevented so much hurt. "Secrets feel like protection," Eleanor said during one of their Sunday dinners, "but they're really just delayed explosions. The truth might hurt in the moment, but at least then you can deal with it, heal from it, move forward. Secrets just keep the wound open, festering until one day it bursts and takes everything down with it." They also learned that trauma doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but understanding trauma helps explain it and creates a path toward change. Marcus couldn't excuse hitting his mother, but understanding the rage that had built up in him over years of unaddressed emotion helped him find compassion for himself while still taking responsibility. Eleanor couldn't excuse trying to sabotage the wedding, but understanding her own terror and how it had driven her actions helped Marcus find compassion for her while still holding her accountable. 2 years later, when Marcus and Sarah had their first child, a daughter they named Hope, Eleanor held her granddaughter and wept. Not sad tears, but tears of gratitude, of redemption, of getting to be part of a future she'd almost destroyed. Marcus watched his mother with his daughter and felt something shift in his chest, forgiveness settling in fully for the first time, not because what happened didn't matter, but because he could see his mother trying every day to be better, and that trying was enough. The story didn't have a perfect ending because life doesn't work that way. They still had hard days, still argued sometimes, still triggered each other's old wounds accidentally. But they had something more valuable than perfection. They had commitment to truth, to growth, to showing up even when it was uncomfortable, to loving each other not in spite of their brokenness, but through it, with it. Learning that maybe broken people putting in the work to heal are stronger than people who never broke in the first place, because they understand how precious and fragile everything is, how easily it can shatter, how much courage it takes to build something beautiful from pieces. So let me ask you this, and I really want you to think about it before you answer. What would you have done if you were Marcus, standing at that altar, hearing those words from your mother in front of everyone you know? Would you have been able to control your anger? Or would you have reacted the same way? And what about Eleanor, if you were a parent, If you truly believed you were protecting your child from making a devastating mistake, how far would you go? Would you stay silent and let them walk into what you thought was danger? Or would you speak up even knowing it might destroy your relationship with them? Here's the harder question. Have you ever kept a secret to protect someone? Or has someone kept a secret from you claiming it was for your protection? How did that work out? Did the secret actually protect anyone? Or did it just delay the pain and make everything worse when the truth finally came out? Think about the people in your life you love most. Are you really being honest with them? Or are you holding back truths because you're afraid of how they'll react, afraid of conflict, afraid of change? And if you're holding back, what's that costing you? What's it costing them? Let me know in the comments how this story made you feel. Did you understand Eleanor's fear even though you disagreed with her actions? Did you judge Marcus for that slap? Or did you feel his pain was so overwhelming that you understood even if you couldn't condone it? And have you ever been in a situation where you discovered something that changed everything you thought you knew about your family, your past, your relationships? I'd love to hear your stories, because that's what we do here. We don't just tell stories, we share them. We connect through them. We realize we're not alone in our struggles, in our pain, and our journey toward healing. If you made it this far, if you watched this entire story, thank you for trusting me with your time, for being willing to sit with uncomfortable truths, for opening your heart to a family's pain and healing. That takes courage. Now, before you go, I want to tell you about next week's story. And trust me, if you thought this one was intense, next week will absolutely leave you speechless. It's about a bride who disappeared 30 minutes before her wedding, vanished without a trace, and when they finally found her 3 days later, what she said about why she left and what she discovered in those missing days, it shattered two families and exposed secrets that went back 40 years. You will not want to miss it. So hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because stories like these, stories that make you think and feel and question everything you thought you knew, these are the stories that matter. And I'll be here every week bringing them to you. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tell me what you thought of Marcus and Eleanor and Sarah. Tell me if you think forgiveness is always possible, or if some things are too broken to fix. I read every single comment because your perspectives, your experiences, your wisdom, they matter to me and to everyone else watching. We're building a community here of people who aren't afraid of hard truths, who understand that real life is messy and complicated and beautiful anyway. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching until the end. And I'll see you next week with a story that will stay with you long after the video ends. Until then, be kind to yourself, be honest with the people you love, and remember that healing is always possible, even after everything falls apart. Especially then.